Good morning, and welcome to the Narkis St Congregation's Shabbat message for January 30th, 2021. And since yesterday was stormy and wet here in Jerusalem, I want to begin with a well known parable about a storm. Once upon a time, a terrible storm came into a town, and local officials sent out an emergency warning that the riverbanks would soon overflow and flood the nearby homes. They ordered everyone in the town to evacuate immediately. A faithful Christian man heard the warning and decided to stay, saying to himself, I will trust God, and if I am in danger, then God will send a divine miracle to save me. The neighbors came by his house and said to him, We're leaving, and there's room in our car for you. Please come with us. But the man declined. I have faith that God will save me. As the man stood on his porch, watching the water rise up the steps, another man in a canoe paddled by, and he called to him, Hurry and come into my canoe. The waters are rising quickly. But the man again said, No thanks. God will save me. The floodwaters rose higher, pouring water into his living room, and the man had to retreat to the second floor. A police motorboat came by and saw him at the window. We will come up and rescue you, they shouted, but the man refused, waving them off, saying, Use your time to save someone else. I have faith that God will save me. The floodwaters rose higher and higher, and the man had to climb up to his rooftop. A helicopter spotted him and dropped a rope ladder. A rescue officer came down the ladder and pleaded with the man, Grab my hand and I will pull you up. But the man still refused, folding his arms tightly to his body. No, thank you. God will save me. Shortly after, the house broke up and the floodwaters swept the man away, and he drowned. When in heaven, the man stood before God and asked, I put all of my faith in you. Why didn't you come and save me? And God said, Son, I sent you a warning. I sent you a car. I sent you a canoe. I sent you a motorboat. I sent you a helicopter. What more were you looking for? What more were you looking for? So, here in the first month of 2021 in Jerusalem at Narkis, we're continuing in our series on the book of Richard Foster, Celebration of Discipline. And we've been studying the ancient spiritual practices that encourage spiritual growth. And this morning, we're looking at simplicity. Foster begins his chapter on simplicity with a quote from Ecclesiastes 7:30. This is the Jerusalem Bible translation. Ecclesiastes 7:30. God made man simple. Man's complex problems are of his own devising. John Wycliffe's Bible translation from the 14th century puts it like this. God made a man rightful, and then he meddled himself with questions without number. So the interpretation here in Ecclesiastes 7:30 is that God made people simple or right at the beginning, but then they went and made things complicated. And so we're looking at the discipline of simplicity, and it's easy to start by pointing the finger at the messiness of our lives and blaming others, governments, churches, institutions, schools, leaders, the police, teachers, lawyers, political movements, protesters, blaming anyone and everybody for making our lives complicated. Isn't this why there's so much turmoil and division in our modern world with all these endless questions and disagreements? Whether it's new theories or new rules or laws or the evolving political and cultural correctness, nothing seems simple anymore. We have more questions now than we do solid answers. What God created simple or right, humanity is now complicated and skewed. How can we live simply in a world that bombards us with storm warnings, cars, with canoes, with police motorboats, and with rescue helicopters? Looking back at Ecclesiastes 7:30, where it says, God made man simple, or other translations have upright. It says in the Hebrew, Asa ha-Elohim et ha-Adam yashar. Today in Israel, when you think of the word yashar, I think of someone giving directions on the street. Yashar, yashar, straight, straight. And that's often a very great answer to give when someone asks you directions on a street in Jerusalem, even if you don't know where it is exactly where they want to go. It's the typical Israeli approach to assume and convey your opinion, even if you're not sure yourself. Yashar, yashar, keep going straight. You're going to come to it. In the Bible, this idea of straight, yashar, comes to describe people who have a character that is straightforward. Their actions are straight, correct, or right in the eyes of the Lord. They have integrity. They do what they say, and they say what they do. No tricks are up their sleeves. Nothing is hidden. They are transparent. They are straight. As Jesus says in Matthew 5:37, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else is from the evil one. So, when we are talking about the biblical idea of simplicity, we're not speaking of some sort of naive, unintelligent fool. Rather, the opposite. We are speaking about the well informed who are honest and straightforward. The English word simple comes from the Latin word simplus, which means single minded. And the opposite of simplicity is duplicity or double minded. The simple display their one true mind, while the duplicitous have two minds. One mind they publicly display to others, while their true thoughts and motives they hide from others. The duplicitous can act differently at different times or to different people. As Foster says in his study guide on celebration of discipline, simplicity is openness, unself consciousness, naturalness. It is the opposite of subtlety, cunning, duplicity. Where simplicity abounds, words can be taken at face value. There is no hidden agenda, and yet simplicity is not synonymous with easy to understand. Jesus was not easy to understand, nor was Paul, but both were characterized by simplicity of speech. Their intent was not to confuse or deceive, but to clarify and illuminate. Simplicity frees us from the tyranny of the self, the tyranny of things, and the tyranny of people. Foster also emphasizes that simplicity is freedom, duplicity is bondage. Simplicity brings joy and balance, while duplicity brings anxiety and fear. In other words, when we practice biblical simplicity, an honest, straightforward, unpretentious life, we walk in freedom, no matter our status in life, even in the lowest of income jobs. But if we practice duplicity, hidden agendas with smoke and mirrors, with an ambitious eye for fame and fortune, even if we become president, we are the saddest of slaves. Fear and anxiety haunt the steps of the double dealing and the deceptive. Joy and contentment can only be found by walking out the truth. So last Shabbat, Dave Forward in Australia gave the message here for Narkis, and he spoke on the book of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet. And he spoke on how, according to Kohelet, a person can only find joy and contentment in this mortal life by recognizing God's authority as creator, and us also recognizing our humble position as his creation. When we fear God or revere him by keeping his commandments, God blesses us with the enjoyment of this mortal life. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 18 and 19 says, "This is what I have observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is their lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God." Foster says, "Simplicity is the only thing that sufficiently reorients our lives so that possessions can be genuinely enjoyed without destroying us. Simplicity sets us free to receive the provision of God as a gift that is not ours to keep and can be freely shared with others." Possessions. Possessions should be our focal point for simplicity this morning, since all habits and behaviors that revolve around the discipline of simplicity are connected to a person's possessions. While we might have worked hard or been lucky or a little bit of both, in order to acquire our possessions, according to the Bible, all possessions are a gift of God. That's the truth. And when we acknowledge that truth, that God is the giver of whatever possessions we may hold, then we can find joy and contentment in whatever our current situation is. Just like Paul, who says in Philippians 4, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength." We find clarity for our lives when we recognize that truth, that God is the giver of every good gift. When we have that perspective, possessions no longer are possessions, objects to hide, or talents to bury. They are gifts, simply gifts, gifts to receive, gifts to invest, and gifts to give away. We all know the Shema in Deuteronomy 6 with its most famous line, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Ve'avta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha uvechol nafshecha uvechol me'odecha." While the translations here of levav for heart and nefesh for soul are quite evident, the translation strength for the Hebrew word me'od is not so obvious. Me'od literally means very or much. Our modern translations that have strength come from the ancient Greek translation. We have no other example in the Hebrew Bible of what loving God with your me'od, your very muchness, could mean. There is a nice example, though, in the Mishnah, which is a Jewish writing contemporary to the time of the New Testament. In Brachot 9:5, me'od is interpreted as mammon, mammon, which is a Hebrew Aramaic word for wealth, money, or possessions. So love the Lord your God with all of your possessions. Contrary to popular evangelical teaching, mammon, is not evil in and of itself. Just like a sword is not evil, but rather you judge what a person does with that sword. So mammon is merely stuff that we have on earth. It's the love of our mammon, the love of our possessions that distract us from the Lord, the giver of these earthly gifts. Jesus said in Matthew 6:24, No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. So, how should we serve God with our me'od, our muchness, our mammon? How do we love God with our possessions? 1 Timothy 6 says in verse 17, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. And in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. We know from the early church in Acts that the members shared their possessions and sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This practice of simplicity, this straightforward singleness of focus and action, was a core teaching of Jesus. So if we go back to Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, we read, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Luke 12:33 explains what treasures in heaven mean, where it says, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But coming back to Matthew 6:22, it continues, Jesus continues, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Here in Matthew 6, as Jesus teaches on how one is to use their possessions, he brings up this enigmatic expression, if your eye is single. In the context of sharing wealth and possessions, the typical Jewish idiom today that we know about to describe a generous person, you would say that they have a good eye, ein tovah. We see an example of this in the Bible in Proverbs 22, verse 9. A tov ein will be blessed, for he has given some of his food to the poor. And the opposite of a generous, good-eyed person is a selfish, evil-eyed person, like the example we have in Proverbs 23, verses 6 and 7. Do not eat the food of a ra ein. Do not crave his delicacies, for he is like someone who has calculated the cost in his mind. So here in Matthew 6:22, where Jesus is teaching on sharing your possessions, not hoarding them, we have this greedy, evil eye, but instead of the generous, good eye, there's this single eye. Dr. Stephen Notley, a member, alumni of Narkis, a scholar at Nyack College in New York City. He studied here in Jerusalem with David Flusser, has written an article on this subject in David Bivens' Jerusalem Perspective, where he points out that singleness of the eye is also a Jewish idiom during the time of Jesus. And he cites the example from the Testament of the patriarchs, This is a Jewish writing from the Second Temple period, which is about the 12 sons of Jacob. And in the one testament of Issachar, it says there, "And now hearken to me, my children, and walk in singleness of heart. The single-minded man covets not gold. There is no envy in his thoughts, nor does he worry with insatiable desire in his mind. For he walks in singleness and beholds all things in uprightness of heart. Keep, therefore, my children, the law of God and attain singleness." So, in other words, the single minded man is not greedy for gold. He does not worry about possessing more and more stuff. So, too, simplicity or single mindedness also describe a generous person. The single minded does not have a double standard or an ulterior motive. Since they hold their possessions loosely, there's no fear of losing them. Simply put, possessions stored up can produce worry. So Jesus continues in Matthew 5, verse 25. "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. As we face the world tomorrow with all of its questions and unknowns, all the complexities of life can be boiled down to godly wisdom, I think. How do we sift and discern information? How do we process and distill truth? How do we make good and wise decisions with our thoughts, with our emotions, with our time, and with our possessions? There are so many things in the news that we can worry about. Returning to our parable about the faithful Christian man who, when faced with a terrible storm, chose to ignore God's good gifts. The storm warnings, the neighbors driving by with a car, the stranger with a canoe, the police motorboat, and the rescue helicopter. Sure, God didn't send Elijah's fiery chariot to rescue him from the rising floodwaters, but he sent a lot of other helpful options. Simplicity sees and accepts the good gifts from God that are right in front of our faces. Duplicity, on the other hand, not only tricks others, but it also deceives ourselves. When we recognize God's good gifts to us in ways we don't always expect, we are empowered to be more transparent and more generous with others. Biblical simplicity calls us to walk single mindedly with integrity, mercy, and humility.